Well, welcome back, and we continue our study in First Timothy. Pray that you're keeping up with the reading. And, my usual recommendation is that if you miss a day or two of reading, don't go back and try to make up. Just jump right in with the current day and press on to the end. So don't make it harder for yourself than you need to. My desire, my prayer for you guys is that you're in the Word every day. That would be my goal. So if you miss a day or two, I know life happens, just jump in with the day's reading. The day's reading, by the way, is 1 Timothy 5. We get down to the practicalities, really, of ministry here, the nuts and bolts of duties toward each other. And particularly convicting to me as I read through this today, and kind of resolve if I have a pastorate at some point in the future to do better. So in verses 1 and 2, first section here opens really with admonition to Timothy to have this familial respect toward the members of his church, the members of the congregation there. Let me just read these. It says, "Do not rebuke an older man, but encourage him as you would a father. Younger men as brothers, older women as mothers, younger women as sisters in all purity." So this familial relationship that Timothy is to cultivate and maintain with the members of the congregation. What a beautiful picture that is of the family of God, the household of God. Verses 3 through 15 then talk about widows. Very interesting here. He spends so much time on widows, which seems to be a big concern in the first century church. Widows then had no really means of support outside their family. They didn't have Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security. They were really dependent on family or other organizations to take care of them financially. And so it's a big concern in the early church and a real witness of the church in the community in which they lived on how they handled widows. In our day, when we are confronted with the needs of others, we often act out of compassion, which is not necessarily a bad thing, don't get me wrong. But Paul here calls the church to a high level of discernment. Look what he does here. First, he asks in these verses to make a discerning distinguish between widows that are in real need versus widows that apparently are just looking for a handout, just handout seekers. He asks Timothy to be careful to find widows or deal with widows who are really destitute versus those who have families that should be caring for them. And I understand this to be primarily families within the church, but maybe not necessarily so. I know I have had occasion in the past to approach family members about the being able to support widows or widowers, in my case, within the church financially because they were struggling to the point where they didn't have enough to eat and had to intervene there. And to good effect, I'd say, even though I'm not positive that the family that I spoke to were believers. But Paul, my point here is, and my point in this, God's point in these verses, is that we're making a distinction between those who are destitute and those who are have family that should be taking care of them. He's also asking Timothy to make a distinction or have discernment between those who are spiritually disciplined and diligent in their moves and their practices versus those who are self-indulgent. So there was a group of widows who were faithful. Dr. Charles Ryrie, if that's a familiar name for you, wrote a book. I think it was his dissertation from his second PhD at the University of Edinburgh, and it's about the role of women in the church. And he has a long chapter on widows in the first century, and how widows who were supported by the church had particular duties that they carried out, such as visitation as well as prayer for the body. Seems to fit with this context here where Paul is telling Timothy to make a distinction between the widows who are spiritually diligent and those who are self-indulgent. Verse 8, I think, is particularly biting. Need to be careful here with this. It says, but if anyone does not provide for his relatives, and especially for members of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. Sobering words there. And if you're responsible for a household, take note of this. Your, I think, primary duty, financially speaking, is for the care of your own family. This, I would suggest, it might be a little, sound blasphemous to some or disturbing to others, but I'd say even beyond your giving at the church, if you have needy family members, members who are truly needy, have real needs, or are destitute, spiritually diligent, and you're not providing for them, you need to take a look at your priorities in giving. Because if you're not taking care of your family, the Lord says here, you've denied the faith, you're worse than an unbeliever. Verses 9 through 15 then specify then these qualifying widows and how they should be handled. Verses 17 to the end of the chapter really talks about leadership at this point. Leadership says that leaders who are, particularly those whose duties are preaching and teaching, are worthy of double honor. Double honor means that they're worthy to be paid financial support from the church. Preaching and teaching are key ministries in the church. They are life-giving ministries to the church. You want to have preachers and teachers who are dedicated to that task because it is so important for the vitality of the local church. So Paul says that such men are to be worthy of double honor. Very careful here about how to handle accusations against leaders in the church. They have to be handled very carefully and above reproach. And that, again, sinning elder has to be rebuked, and rebuked publicly, because he says that it's a warning for all. So I think, again, a sinning elder, when they sin, their sin needs to be named. You can't just gloss it over. The sin needs to be named, and the sin clearly needs to be acknowledged by the sinner, by the elder. And this becomes a warning for everyone. These rules, Timothy is being told here, are to be imposed and followed strictly, that is, very carefully, and impartially. You know, when you're serving in leadership with other leaders of the church, other elders or deacons, you develop close relationships with them. And Paul is warning Timothy here not to allow those close relationships to compromise your enforcement of this discipline within the church. So he's telling him to be careful, not to compromise. And then lastly, that both sin and good deeds will be known alike. I'm sure you've seen this in your own life. Sins don't stay hidden, and good deeds don't stay hidden either, for that matter. So I think Paul's word to Timothy here is, Timothy, don't be in a rush. Don't be in a hurry. Time will tell. Some applications here. Again, churches need to be aware of the widows in the congregation, especially those who have real needs, and the church should help them. I'm glad that most churches have some kind of benevolence fund, but very rarely, if ever, have I seen a specific ministry to make sure that the needs, the real needs of godly widows were taken care of. It's very important, and I think it's important that church leaders, I know in the future I'll be more diligent about this myself, but I think it's pretty clear here that they are to be cared for. The other is that elders whose duty is preaching and teaching should be supported in their ministry and at the same time should be held accountable for their lives and for their teaching. So it's a two-edged sword. When you aspire to this office, as it says in 1 Timothy 3, that there's our privileges and responsibilities, duties and requirements, qualifications. It's very important that both be recognized, both be honored. And finally, as I said, be very patient in both honoring people and in bringing rebuke against them. Time will tell. And time is a friend, time is on your side. So be careful not to rush into things and to, impartially enforce these rules, this guidance that the Lord has given us on how his church is to be run. So God bless you, brothers and sisters. I hope this is proving useful to you. Remember, this is not just instructions to leaders. This is not just something that your pastor has to read. This is for the whole church. And the whole church working together has to be diligent to conduct the church as the Lord desires. So you need to be involved. You need to speak up. There is no neutrality. You're going to stand before the Lord someday and give an account. So God bless you, brothers and sisters, and press on in your reading for the week.